The doctor's face did not change when he said it. He had the kind of calm that makes the room tilt toward forever. Namdi stared at the fluorescent light above, at the way it pooled on the hospital tile, and heard the sentence land like a closed door. The chances he would walk again were slim. The wheelchair felt like a sentence and a stage prop at once. Everything about it announced vulnerability in a building that smelled of antiseptic and waited for drama. Nodona, as she liked to be called, tilted her head, took in Namdi's folded hands, the slow rise of the monitor's numbers, and frowned, not with tenderness, but with calculation. There was a 5-second stretch of silence where pity might have fit. Instead, Na unfolded a phone and scrolled. Her lips moved faintly as she checked flight details. A boutique trunking site notification, a message from Zab. She set the phone on the seat between them, not touching his hand, and asked, in the same soft tone she used at galas, "Who will manage the companies while you recuperate?" Namdi's mother, Comfort Okoro, had warned him once, years ago, when his first apartment in Atlanta was still echoing with the cheap wiring of dreams. She had come with a pot of pepper soup and a hand calloused from a lifelong market stall, sat him down on a folding chair, and said one line that never left him. Watch her hands, not her mouth. He had laughed then, foolish, young laughter. In the hospital, that laughter felt like a different language. If you like jaw-dropping twists and stories where riches reveal character, stay with me. He had everything, and he had almost everything to lose. Born in ABA, he had left a small house crowded with 12 cousins and a mother who made the kind of pepper soup that sent people home healed. He had arrived in the US with 1 suitcase and 2 ideas. Don't be afraid to fail, and never forget where you are from. Namdi's first office lease was a receptionist's folding table in Midtown. His first hire was a cousin who could code until the sun came up. The app that changed everything was a practical thing, payment gateways with a human face, but it catapulted him into the kind of money that makes people think they can buy the story they want to live. At a charity gala 6 months after the IPO, he saw Naudo move across a room like she owned the light. She was in a dress that knew how to command a camera. She laughed, a laugh tuned to applause. They were photographed leaning into each other beneath a chandelier. Later, she accepted his proposal on a rooftop, took his ring as if it completed an outfit, and asked, very sincerely, "Will your mother come to the wedding?" It was the right question to say, and Namdi said yes, because it was written into his future the way his mother's voice had become ink on the map of his life. Comfort watched from the edges of that future. She hugged him on the day the engagement was announced and smelled the perfume and tightened her grip before whispering that same proverb, "Watch her hands, not her mouth." Namdi nodded then, and again, later, when she said, more softly, "He who uses gold to hide his neighbor's heart will find the house empty." Comfort's advice had the bluntness of market wisdom. It was a lantern she handed him, and he set it on the table and pretended not to see it. In private, the first red flags were like mosquitoes. Small, irritating at first. Na's taste was not a thing he minded. He had a designer closet and a private jet, and an appreciation for people who looked good beside him. But late-night calls with a voice that hushed and laughed easily. A meal he paid for where she would casually ask how the inheritance process moved. A lingering question about whether the prenuptial agreement could be less formal. Those were the bites. The balcony that night smelled of cut grass and pool-clean chemicals. The city blinked below in scattering windows. Nam was returning to his penthouse after a meeting when his phone vibrated with the sound of a FaceTime ring. On the screen, Na's face was lit by a ring light. She was talking to someone, and Nam stepped closer to the railing and listened because, in the way lovers spy on each other, he wanted to know the cadence of her loyalty. "Money is the plan, babe," she said, voice soft for a camera, not loud enough for Nam at first. But then she turned the phone, and the voice of Zob, loud, pleased, filled the air. "He's rich, right? We lock the date, we get the prenup adjusted, we make sure his shares are in our favor. It's practical. People do it all the time." Nam felt his chest leave the room for a second. She laughed. "I love him," she added, "like a color you paint over a bruise." He watched her fingers gesturing, manicured, quick, and saw them move in ways his mother had warned him about. He recorded nothing, There was no cinematic evidence. Just the way words fall when someone is thinking on a scale of currency rather than a scale of the heart. There are moments people later tell you are obvious, and you realize only afterward their obviousness was a kind of cruel clarity. For Nam, one of those moments came when Nay asked, almost casually, if the wedding planner could manage the guests, and then in the same breath, asked what would happen to his steak if he couldn't manage anymore. When he confronted her, she smiled that immaculate smile and called him melodramatic. When he asked Zob about the FaceTime, Zob replied with a shrug and a laugh and said, "We're friends. You're lucky." That shrug had a weight. He could have walked away, quietly and cleanly, and perhaps that would have been enough. But pride and grief looked the same in the mirror. Nam felt, in the way you feel a fever before it breaks, that his story needed a truth that would not be optional to those around him. The option of letting the truth be simple break engagement, move on didn't seem like a story worthy of the wound. He wanted clarity. He wanted to know who would sit in the small hours and listen to a man whose body had betrayed him. There was a man he trusted more than his own certainty. Drdadd. Chinadu had been an anchor in Nam's life since the crash, when the app took a nosedive. He had stood by him when investors left, when servers burned, when the press sniffed trouble. He was a neurosurgeon with a mind that measured outcomes and a loyalty that once fixed a panic attack with a text. Nam called him and, for the first time, asked not for a diagnosis, but for counsel. Chinadu's voice was even, the kind that calmed rather than inflamed. "What are you trying to prove?" he asked. "Is this about proving her, or proving yourself?" Nam said it was both. He would not make the choice lightly. He would pace the ethics like a tightrope. He would think in loops until the motion stopped. He would search for a place where truth could be seen without inviting ruin. They spoke long into the night in low tones, not about the mechanics of making a headline, but about what would happen when a man younger than his years was made to look helpless, and what that would take from everyone involved. When the press finally did its work, the office phones drowned in sympathy. Online, article titles folded into one another. Beloved founder struck by accident. Company stock wavers. Millionaire's health uncertain. Feeds filled with candle emojis and prayers. He watched the flood while he sat in the wheelchair and understood a new brutality. Kindness on demand comes easy. Sacrifice asked for at home is a different thing altogether. Na appeared at the hospital in Prada and perfume, touched his forehead like a celebrity marking a beat, and took photographs that would later become the currency of her kindness on social media. She posed with a blank, careful compassion, the kind that photographs well. She signed cards with a flourish, smiled at the camera, and on a night when Nam's blood pressure swam up and down left at 11, with a bag of new shoes and an excuse about an early flight for fittings. She attended a Sunday station performance. At the same time his mother came with pepper soup and a patient look. Comfort watched N.A. from across the room. Brows knitted not in contempt, but with the knowledge of the market. Later, when Nam told his mother how Nay had left early, Comfort's only comment was a small, sharp phrase of practical theology. Watch her hands. Back at the mansion, things rearranged themselves into two trajectories. Nas was upward and outward Instagram stories, brunch appearances, a house staff who revered her taste. Ify's trajectory was inward and slow. She arrived on a wet Tuesday in October with a modest bag and a smile that did not wait to be asked. Ifwana, called Ify by everyone who loved her, had the quiet craft of someone raised on small, careful labors. She folded sheets with a tenderness that felt like prayer. She learned the house's rhythms without being told. Ify was not flashy. Her clothes were modest, her hands roughened from honest work, and she carried a small wooden tortoise in her pocket, an object carved on a rainy afternoon in Inugu by an uncle who believed a slow animal kept secrets well. When she knelt to straighten Namdi's blanket, she did so at eye level as if to say, "I see you." She brought him pepper soup in a chipped bowl on his first night home. Not the oat pepper soup of a celebrity chef, but the deep, home-seasoned kind that hit the back of the throat like a memory. It is striking the way small things become proof. A handed cup of soup tastes like care. A carved tortoise placed on a bedside table becomes more than wood. It becomes a symbol of consistency. Ivy sat with him while the house hummed with a staff that did not talk about loyalty but about loyalty's cost. When he asked her why, she stayed. She shrugged and answered with a proverb she learned from her grandmother, "Two hands wash each other's bowl." She did not say that she cared because of his status. She said it because, in her world, service was a way of seeing. There were quiet rules in the mansion. Na appeared in the drawing room with glossy hair and asked to be shown the guest list. Ivy came in with the laundry and a quiet smile. When Nay wanted the rings polished for a pre-wedding dinner, Ivy took them to the small side table and polished them like an offering. When Namdi wept in private, it was Ivy who, without drama, sat on the floor and held his hand. The ring against her palm was warm and ordinary. Namdi watched her hands washing, folding, resting and thought of his mother's voice again. The prophecy of those words made a map of tenderness that he followed, like a pilgrim. Ivy did not tell him what he wanted to hear. She said, "Take your time." She brought him a wooden tortoise one night small, its shell sanded smoothened, set it on his bedside, like a tiny sentinel. "My uncle says the tortoise remembers the slow ones," she said. "It remembers who is faithful." There was a night when the house felt like two worlds separated by glass. Now hosted a fundraiser in the great hall with velvet curtains and an orchestra. The chandelier trembled with wealth. Namdi watched from his room, while Ivy sat beside him, sipping simple tea. The fundraiser streamed and later became a highlight reel of Na's smile with donors. She posted photographs and captions about resilience. Ivy, who did not own a personal camera, took Namdi's hand and mended a hem while he told stories of above markets and pepper, soup, and a boy who would hide under his mother's bed to avoid the rain. The way Namdi told those stories, he remembered the years when he slept on a mattress with a mosquito net and ate stew from the same bowl for a week because that meant there was money to plant a server. He told Ivy about the first time he saw a computer and felt it was a door of the cousin who left to look after a sick parent and came back with code that would feed them all. Ivy listened as if each sentence were a seed. She did not interrupt with advice. She pressed a wooden spoon against the bowl and tasted the pepper soup he had warmed and smiled small. "Your mother makes it like this," he said. "It heals," she answered. "Good soup is like prayer. It is meant to be shared." Weeks stretched. Na's visits were precise and callous. She asked about press releases and who would manage the board, in a tone that mistook authority for affection. She texted late at night asking if a certain model would be appropriate for a holiday campaign. Ivy's presence was an undercurrent. She straightened the house, knitted little comforts into the corners, and without fanfare sat through the long afternoon silences with him, when his body ached from the explanations of doctors and the dull shock of being less able. Ivy was the one who adjusted the pillow and brought the warm compresses from a medicine cabinet she kept by practical impulse, not ceremony. There was a turning point that had nothing to do with declarations and everything to do with listening. Namdi, one evening when the rain pressed itself against the windows, told Ivy about the FaceTime on the balcony. He told her about the question of inheritance, the way Na folded concern between questions about fittings. He told her how his mother's proverb had been a lantern he ignored until it burned. Ivy did not gasp. She did not immediately conclude with outrage. She pressed her palms together and said only, "That is small thinking. People who build with fear do not understand how to stay." When he confessed some of his plan, careful not to test the bounds of confession, because both of them were wrapped in the ethical fog of Edifi's face, did not harden. She listened and then reached for the wooden tortoise, turning it in her hand. "You have to be careful with tests," she said softly. "They can tell you the truth, or they can make it. If the thing you learn is that there is no care, what will you do with that knowledge?" Her question landed like a stone in water, and the circles ran and widened. Namdi did not answer her that night. He looked at the tortoise, at its smooth, curving shell, and thought of walking again, of the absurd theater of standing to prove a point. He thought about the man he wanted across the kitchen table. Not a red carpet. He thought about the boy he had been, and a woman who would sit and fold a towel and look at him like a person rather than a prize. Ify did not offer schemes. She offered presents, and in doing so produced a new problem. Namdi's wound wanted clarity, and clarity demanded confrontation. There were whispers in the house staff room. Loyalty has its currency and discretion its own coin. Some servants adored Anne for the sparkle she brought, tips, attention, a drama that made the quiet corridors shimmer with gossip. Others watched as she circled the hospital like a celebrity at a ribbon cutting, handing cameras the image of concern. It made for tension at dinner tables and small disagreements over shifts. Ify, who had grown up listening to elders say that one should not throw stones from a glass house, kept her counsel and did her work. One afternoon, Comforter Cora arrived without announcement. She walked through the front door with the force of someone used to being unremarked until needed. Her eyes scanned the vastness of the room, landed on the wheelchair, and then on the woman who moved like a headline. Comfort carried her pot of pepper soup like an offering and sat at Namdi's bedside with the simplicity of someone who had seen generations come and go. She met Ify's eyes, and in that exchange was a recognition. This was a woman who remembered the market, who had known the price of care. Comfort did not need to ask questions. She did not ask about the staged headlines or about truth. She sat and sang an old hymn her mother taught her and tucked the blanket around Namdi with a practiced hand. "Watch her hands, not her mouth," she repeated into the steam of the pepper soup, the line like a ribbon tied round a present. Ify looked up at her, and Comfort's face softened. "The tortoise knows," Comfort said, and in her voice was memory of rain and pins, and the strength of people who make a life out of what they have. When Namdi and Ify talked that night, the house felt both too big and intimate. He asked her why she stayed, and she answered with the honesty of someone who had made peace with smallness and desired goodness instead. She wanted to finish nursing school, she said. She wanted to be able to hold people and to have a certificate that would let her work in a hospital of her own. Namdi listened, and something loosened inside him. The idea of Ify in a uniform, of her hands steady with training, seemed to match like a key to a lock he had not known was there. There was a private dignity in Ify's dreams that made Namdi see his own life differently. She was not dazzled by the house. She knew how to breathe in it without inhaling the vanity. She had a small wooden tortoise on the bedside that some nights he found himself tracing with his thumbs, looking at the worn grooves. He began to bring her small things, a book about Enugu markets she might like, a new pair of work shoes she would not accept until he offered them as tools, not gifts. She would smile and say, "This is for work," and tuck them away like secrets. And yet, there was a wound that did not close. Namdi could not unsee Na's hands. The balcony conversation was a stone in his shoe that made every step chafe. He wrestled with the ethics of humiliation and the cruelty of remaining indefinite. He wanted proof without spectacle. He wanted to know because the idea of marrying someone who had measured his life by its yield was a thought he could not abide. Late, one night, when the mansion had gone quiet and the servants had faded to the rooms they were allowed, Namdi wheeled himself not for the first time to the balcony where the city glowed like a rumor. Ify followed him without noise. She stood beside him and looked out at the skyline as if it were a story she already knew the ending to. The rain had made the glass glow. "I could humiliate her," Namdi said. "I could show everyone the recording, the messages, everything. I could make sure it is public." Ify's hand rested lightly on his arm, and for the first time a laugh escaped him that tasted like relief. "You could," she said. "But manners are a slow thing. They can teach you how to be cruel in a polite way. That is not the same as justice." Namdi turned to her. The night made her features soft. "What would you do?" he asked. She looked at his hands, the ones his mother insisted he watch in others, and said, "I would ask who you are trying to save. If it is your dignity, you can keep it. If it is your heart, then you must be careful. Some truths are sharp as knives. Others heal when you hold them to the light." He wanted, in that instant, to trust someone who could speak color into a monochrome ache. He wanted someone who would not make his brokenness a spectacle or a trophy. Ify did not promise him vows or plans or counsel on how to expose someone. She promised only herself and the small mercy of presence. That, for Namdi, became heavier than any headline. The house continued its twin narratives. Behind glass and silk, Na plotted the social architecture of a union she thought would elevate her to permanence. She called designers and discussed heirlooms. She asked questions that were sharp but polite. She made lists and asked how the photographer would frame her. Meanwhile, if the house had a pulse, it was in the kitchen where Ify worked and in the small private moments where she and Namdi ate pepper soup from a chipped bowl and told stories of markets and fathers who had taught prudence. He found himself looking for her in the morning, hearing her steps like a metronome for the day. Her hands, the hands that mended and warmed and remembered the recipe of his childhood, had become, in his mind, proof that there was something more stable than money. But the unresolved question remained, what would he do with the knowledge that Na had calculated before she had loved? Namdi had the power to make the knowledge public. He could cause a scandal and clear his conscience with spectacle. Or he could keep the truth like a secret and let it corrode him slowly. The weight of that decision lay upon him like a physical thing, and for the first time since the diagnosis, he felt the solidity of choice. He began to record not other people's misdeeds, but moments of care. He kept a list of times Na left early, and the times Ify stayed till morning to hold the cup of tea. He started a notebook with dates and small notes. June 3rd, Na 11 p.m. flight, Ify stayed. Pepper, soup, comfort. He did not plan pageantable exposure. He catalogued evidence of heart. It felt less like plotting revenge and more like measuring love. At night, he sat with the wooden tortoise and turned it over in his hand. He imagined standing again, not to prove a point but because he wanted to know who would still hold his hand when it was heavy. The idea of testing someone's love by turning weakness into a stage was ugly, yet he could not escape the drive to know. The weeks after were a tapestry of small actions. Na continued to charm the world. She posted curated images of herself visiting Nam with captions about resilience. People sent her heartfelt messages. Ify kept the house in a calm that felt almost sacred. She brewed ginger for his stomach and threaded a needle through a broken cuff without fuss. Namdi's mother, Comfort, came more often now, and each time she arrived she brought providential food and the same worn proverb. She watched Ify without the eye of judgment, but with the blunt affection reserved for someone who remembered how to cook with salt and salt with story. The relationship between Namdi and Ify deepened not in grand gestures but in small scenes. There was the afternoon she braided his hair back from his forehead because the nurse had trimmed his edges too harshly. He woke from a nap to find her humming and a bowl of stew cooling on the tray. There was the morning she sat with him while he held the paper that listed the board's questions, and simply read aloud in a steady voice. There was a night when the house lost power and Ify lit candles and told a folk tale about a tortoise who took its time and ended with a laugh that tasted like liberation. But the calendar would not be still. Invitations arrived. There were engagements to plan, guests to confirm. The idea of a wedding loomed an image of long tables and chandeliers, of Na in a dress designed like armor. Namdi felt the pressure of 1,000 people watching before any one person had proven their fidelity. He thought of marrying in a way that would make for glossy magazine spreads, and then thought of marrying in a room where pepper soup was served in earthen bowls. And vows were simple and small. One afternoon, he called Chinedu again. They walked to the edge of a park, two men with the responsibilities of other people on their shoulders. You can't make people see themselves, Chinedu said. You can only show them a mirror and let them decide what to do with it. Namdi listened and felt something hard shift. He was less interested now in making a spectacle and more interested in letting truth be visible in a place it could not be squinted away. Yet, the world moved faster. Digital whispers hardened into stories. The headlines had already taught people a version of him, and he wondered which version he wanted to live with. He watched Na rehearse a public story of care with a stylist and realized the choreography of charity could outshine the choreography of love. If the world wanted a performance, he could give them one, but for whom would it be real? It is dangerous to make pronouncements about mercy when one has the power of spectacle. Namdi felt the drag of temptation like a shadow at the edge of everything. He also felt, in the smallest of places, when Ify brought him pepper soup at midnight and sat on the edge of the bed, when she pushed a plate toward him and said, quietly, "Eat, so we can talk," that the story he wanted was not the one that would make the best headline. It would be private, clumsy, ordinary. It would be the kind of life where people knew each other's soup recipes. He began to imagine a different wedding, one with a handful of chairs and a son that did not care to be photographed. He thought of ABA and a church with wooden pews and a reception that smelled of stewed meat and rice. He pictured Ivy in a simple dress and his mother beaming, the carved tortoise placed on the table as a symbol of continuity rather than status. But before he could move into that imagined life, a choice remained. Should he confront Na publicly, show the cracks, and end the engagement in a blast, or should he act quietly and let the truth clear itself like rain washes dust from a window? If he chose the first, he would break a life in order to heal another. If he chose the second, he risked living with a compromise. The weeks that followed were a study in contrasts. Na added more layers to her persona, charity posts, strategic posts blurring the lines between empathy and image. She arranged a pre-wedding gala at the Ritz, a spectacle that would appear in feeds and magazines and imprint on the night as a kind of coronation. She wanted the staff whispered to make sure everything was perfect, to secure a version of permanence that came with an audience. Ify, in the meantime, enrolled in evening classes' first steps toward her dream of nursing school. She studied anatomy diagrams at night under the lamp, translating them into practical knowledge she could use. She asked questions at the clinic where she volunteered and came home buzzing about a nurse's kindness and a child's fever. When Namdi saw how she spoke of small things with a big tenderness, the chasm between appearance and substance narrowed in his mind. He was not yet willing to act. He sat in the dark, fingers around the wooden tortoise, and thought about the meaning of proof. Did he want to humiliate Na because she had been calculating? Would public exposure make him feel whole? Or would it cheapen the very thing he wanted, honest companionship? The decision made him sick at his core, as if the weight of a life could be measured by the number of times you chose between spectacle and tenderness. Then, one Sunday afternoon, after a brunch of stale consolation and private prayers, a small crisis pushed the question forward. Na, in a conversation with a friend, spoke of the marriage like a ledger. She used words that made accountants proud and husbands invisible. The friend laughed, and the record of that laughter landed in Namdi's lap like a verdict. He looked at the people around him, his mother, who had driven across town bringing soup and proverbs, Ify, who had sat with him while he slept and had braided his hair back, Chinadu, who had given him the language to think ethically, and Na, who smiled for cameras. He felt the absurdity of spending a life building something beautiful only to hand it to someone who saw the architecture and not the heartbeat. That night, he did something he had been avoiding. He leaned into a mirror and looked at himself as though he were trying on an identity. The man who would go public and the man who would choose his own private truth. The choice was not about revenge. It was about who would keep him when he was small. He thought of the tortoise and the pepper soup and the proverb that had come with a mother's hands. He called Ify into the study. The house was quiet enough to hear the city breathe through the windows. When she entered, she did not ask why. She knew. He told her, finally, that he had evidence of Na's calculations of late-night calls and plans that treated marriage as an acquisition. He told her that he had come to realize he wanted to know what was true before making something as permanent as vows. Ify sat down and folded her hands in her lap. She did not offer a plan or a shout. She offered steady words. You must be careful not to make your own wound into a public thing, she said. But if you need to know, ask yourself what proof you want to carry forward in a marriage. Do you want to carry proof of humiliation or proof of faithfulness? Namdi listened like a man gathering pieces to build a shelter. He had not expected such a small, stubborn dignity to be the thing that would make his decision. He realized then that the evidence he most craved was not merely something that would ruin. It was the assurance that, in the quiet of a home, someone would still be there. He did not, that night, choose spectacle. He did not march to a stage and read names aloud. He decided instead to look for the truth in the only place that would give him a daily answer. The small, sustained acts of care. He would watch hands, not mouths. He would observe the daily ledger of kindness. But life is unwilling to wait for philosophical resolutions. The world kept spinning, and invitations arrived, and Na planned, and Ify studied, and Namdi felt the pressure of a life that had to find its answers soon. The tension tightened like a cord, ready to be struck. At dinner, he sat and felt it. The possibility of exposure like a distant thunder, and the promise of a quieter life like the hush after rain. The story had begun to bend toward a decision, and every pepper soup, wooden tortoise, the proverb, a recording on a balcony had become a lodestone. Namdi found himself at a threshold. He could let the question of Naudo's love remain open and marry into uncertainty, or he could force a light into the room and see what the darkness sheltered. Either way, people would be seen. Either way, consequences would follow. On the terrace, with the city lights flickering like distant fires, he turned the wooden tortoise over one last time and said the words he had been saving like a prayer. Ify, standing beside him, watched the gesture and said nothing. The night swallowed the sound, but the choice had a shape now. He would not move until he felt certain of what care looked like. The next day, the invitation for the pre-wedding gala arrived in an envelope embossed with gold. It glittered like a promise. Namdi looked at it as if at a dare. He folded it and slipped it into his pocket and, for reasons he could not articulate simply, called Chinadu and asked him to come by for tea. They sat as afternoon light made the mansion's marble glow. Namdi told his friend about the balcony, the recordings, the small kindnesses, and about Ify and her tortoise. Chinadu listened and then, in a careful, even voice, said, "Truth will always ask a price. The price can be paid in spectacle or in private grief. Choose the currency that lets you sleep." Namdi wanted sleep more than anything. He wanted a life where the night did not buzz with questions. He wanted to build a marriage with someone who would sit with a fever and bring pepper soup without checking the cost of the ring. He wanted a hearth, not a headline. As the house prepared for another social season and Nay practiced her speeches, Ify went to her first class at the community college nervous, determined. She learned bandages and patient care, names of bones, and how to make a chart. Namdi watched her go and felt, in a way that startled him, pride. He had not expected to feel protective towards someone who once he would have thought unremarkable. He had not expected to feel the small crises of awe when she returned with stories of a child she had helped. The days that followed were measured in small moments that had the weight of verdicts. A cup of tea stayed warm because Ify had tended it. A phone call remained unanswered because Na was in a photo shoot. A ring sat on a dresser, polished until it shone like an accusation. Namdi walked through the house and saw the contradictions. And then came the invitation to the gala, glittering prelude to the wedding was meant to lock the image. Invitations printed on heavy stock, a string quartet booked, and a guest list that read like a who's who of philanthropy and venture capital. Na practiced her smile in the mirror until the angle was perfect. She practiced the bit of modesty she would perform between speeches. The mansion sighed with preparations. Flowers arrived like small flags. The staff moved with the smooth choreography of people who had rehearsed their roles until they felt like second nature. Namdi watched the rehearsals from a corner of the drawing room, the wooden tortoise warm in his hand. He had not told Ify exactly what he would do that night. He had promised only that truth would be given a place to be seen. Ify, as ever, kept her counsel. She had her class notes in a bag, and the neatness of her handwriting made Namdi think of the way she tended things. Careful, considerate, persistent. At the gala, the room shimmered. Cameras drifted like moths. People moved in groups, stories slipping from mouth to mouth. Na glided between them, her laughter a practiced currency. She posed for photographs with Namdi at her side. She kissed his brow for the cameras with a softness that read like public tenderness. Guests complimented her on the work she had done for the charity. She accepted praise as if it were a garment tailor-made to fit. But closeness is not only a visual thing. Namdi watched in the way someone watches a playful her hands when she adjusted a cuff, her eyes when she heard a question about shares. Her gestures were always just so. He saw something practiced in them. He also watched Ify at a distance, in the kitchen doorway, smoothing a napkin, offering a quiet word to a nervous caterer. Ify's movements never sought a lens. They were the movement of someone who did not need an audience to be kind. A week passed. The wedding invitations gained RSVP. The vendor contracts piled up. The town square of the internet made room for speculation. The staged headlines: beloved founder injured, company shares dip. Community rallies kept the public's attention in the days that ticked toward the ceremony. For Namdi, this was an ordeal of every day he catalogued kindnesses and absences, the slow arithmetic of hearts. He had told himself he would not use spectacle lightly. He had also told himself he needed certainty. The wedding day arrived like a tide. The ballroom at the Ritz had been transformed into an ocean of white and gold. Chandeliers hung like constellations. Music filled the corners. There were floral arrangements wired with small lights, and the hush as guests took their seats felt like the inhale before a chorus. Na entered, as if the room had been designed to bend around her. She descended the staircase, every movement polished, every smile calibrated to land at several cameras at once. Namdi watched from the edge of the dais. In the wheelchair he had used these months. The press flashed. People whispered about the perseverance of love, about resilience. His mother sat in the front row, her hands folded, a bowl of pepper soup cooling at her feet. Her face was a map of market wisdom and hard-earned joy. Ify was near the back, not as a spectator but as someone who belonged to a different kind of witness, the staff table by the back door, where she had folded a scarf for comfort and smoothed a runner for the cake. Her dress was simple. She carried the wooden tortoise in a small cloth pocket, as if to keep its memory close. When she looked at Namdi, there was no stage, only a man she had learned to know in many small, steady ways. Namdi's plan, whatever its moral complexity, had always been to force a moment of truth where it could not be refused. He had chosen the wedding because it would gather the people who mattered. His family, investors, friends, and the woman he intended to marry. The room would be full of witnesses. The Fukaday would be under a light too bright to hide behind. He had not wanted cruelty. He wanted clarity. He rose, or rather, he signaled he would speak. The ceremony paused. A hush dropped like a curtain. He wheeled forward, and when the microphone was passed to him, he began not with accusation, but with the kind of quiet that makes a rumor fold in on itself. He thanked the people who had come, the doctors, the nurses, the friends who had sent messages. He spoke of vulnerability and of the way life can surprise you. His voice was steady. His eyes found his mother's first. Kumfla's face softened and she nodded once, an anchor to his courage. Then he told a story from a balcony, the memory of a FaceTime, a voice that treated marriage like a ledger. He did not mock. He did not gloat. He told the facts with the restraint of someone who had lived inside their ache long enough to make art out of it. He said he had listened, that he had watched hands and heard certain conversations that had not matched the images she'd shown the world. He did not numb. He made a choice about language sharp enough to illuminate, gentle enough to preserve dignity. After those words, he paused and handed the microphone to someone he trusted. From somewhere in the technical corner, a recording played clips of conversations not designed to humiliate, but to show. It was short and quiet and terrible in its own way. Voices deciding how to secure assets, laughter at the expense of a man whose body had been made temporarily less by design. The room shifted. Camera flashes went dull against the sound of people breathing. Naudo's face, at first practiced into calm, faltered. The smile that had been perfectly sculpted for headlines cracked into something raw. She tried to speak. The string of rehearsed phrases she had practiced for months turned brittle. There were murmurs in the crowd. People shifted their feet. Her friends reached for her, but they could not reach the part of her that had been recorded making plans that read like a transaction. Namdi did not shout. He did not make the night about vengeance. He told the guests he had set a test because he wanted to know who would be present when the cameras left. He said he had been trying to find evidence of something he suspected, and that he had found it. His words were measured and they hurt because truth is a blunt instrument. Then he asked for one thing: that those who had come as spectators remember the private costs of spectacle. He asked if any who had loved him for who he was would step forward. He asked for the room to be honest about what they valued. At that moment, something happened that no one had expected. Ify stood quietly at the edge of the room. She walked across the carpet, not with the purpose of spectacle, but with the kind of urgent steadiness that belongs to someone who has been present in the small hours. She took Namdi's hand and leaned forward, looking not at the cameras but at the person she had come to know. "You have always fed my hope, like soup," she said, in a voice that carried across the hall. "I will not pretend to be anything I am not. I have sat with him. I have seen his mornings and his bad nights. I have learned his stories because he told them. If he is to stand, it will be because he wants to, and not because he wants to punish." It was not a speech for the tabloids. It was an offering. The room listened because there was an authority in words that were humble and exact. Then Namdi did something the tabloids would later replay in slow motion. He reached for the back of his chair, found a lean of balance he had practiced in private, and stood. He stood not to humiliate but to reveal a truth the test had uncovered, that his paralysis had not been what it seemed. The action was short and terrible in its implications. The room stilled as if the air had been sucked from it. Na's knees buckled and she sank onto a seat like a person The motion was not melodramatic, it was a surrender to the shock of being seen. Her face, earlier powdered for photographs, was now raw. She tried to explain. She tried to stitch together the rehearsed compassion with the words she had used in private, but the two did not meet. Security, instructed earlier only to keep the night from violence, escorted her quietly away. There was no spectacle of shaming, only the practical movement of a woman who had become a liability to the ceremony. Some guests turned to the screens that looped the footage. Others clutched at the shoulders of people beside them. Cameras recorded, but the thing that would live on was not the footage alone. It was the sense of a man choosing his own truth over a public illusion. Namdi did not dance in triumph. He hugged his mother first. Comfort put her hand on his cheek, as if to check the man beneath the headlines. She said nothing more than what she had always said. "Watch her hands." Not her mouth. Her words landed like a benediction in the hush. After the event, the aftermath took the shape of quiet consequences. Na had been a public darling. The internet had loved her look and her staged compassion. Now the same platforms gnawed at the seam. Her PR team scrambled. Some of her friends explained and some stepped away. There were questions about ethics and the cost of ambition. Some journalists called for interviews. Some called for compassion. Legal murmurs rose like fog talk of rights and damages, but the story that mattered to Namdi was simpler. He had chosen to honor the people who had shown him care without cameras. Ivy did not seek the spotlight. Journalists wanted to know the story of the maid who had nursed a billionaire back to moral and physical balance. Producers wrote emails. She declined most invitations, saying she had studied the next morning and a patient at the clinic who needed a bandage. She answered questions with the matter-of-factness of someone who had always had to explain the obvious. That care is work. That service is not a thing to be romanticized. In the months that followed, life folded differently. Ivy completed her certificate, then her degree, and took a position at a hospital where the night shift was long and the rewards were honest. She learned to read charts and to steady trembling hands. She carried the wooden tortoise in her bag for luck and memory. Namdi visited not as a man handing out charity, but as someone who had chosen a different life. He helped quietly with tuition and with contacts that could not buy character but could open doors. They moved slowly through a friendship that learned how to be ordinary and brave at once. There was a small ceremony, not at a Ritz ballroom, but in ABA. In the church where Namdi's family had always said prayers. The reception smelled of stewed meat and of food made by hands that had never thought to style themselves for cameras. Comfort Okoro stood at the head of the small table, bowl of pepper soup, steaming like a cymbal. She gave Namdi a look that meant both reproach for his suffering and a blessing for his choosing. She put her hand into Ivy's, feeling the palm as if to test the grain of it. "Watch her hands," she said aloud for everyone near enough to hear. "She keeps what's important." They married with laughter that did not worry about image, with vows that spoke of presence and of the everyday promise to bring soup when the fever rose and to mend a shirt when the seam split. The wooden tortoise found a place on the table, worn and smoothed by fingers. It was not an ornament so much as a story made tangible. As for Na, the public life she had curated lost some of its luster. A variety of consequences unfurled. Friends moved away. Partnerships cooled. and the conversations about motives shadowed any philanthropic praise she attempted to offer. Some doors closed that a designer dress could not reopen. The law took its measured course in some small claims and disputes over contracts. It was, like most legal matters, slow and procedural, and the story's moral center remained the human reckoning. Namdi did not celebrate her fall. He chose not to frame her life as a cautionary tale for gossip. He preferred to let their shared history be a lesson that would be recounted quietly among friends about the cost of ambition when it outruns compassion. Namdi and Ife rebuilt, not a life of spectacle, but one of quiet resilience. He stepped back from some of the more performative aspects of his public profile and invested in scholarships and clinics in Nigeria. He returned to Lagos and ABA, often bringing skills and resources that meant something in neighborhoods that had not been photographed. Ife taught a class at the community health center, smiling as she explained how to comfort a fevered child and how to wrap a wound so it might heal clean. Comfort watched over them with a reserved pride. She would sit with a bowl of pepper soup and watch the way Ife set a plate at the table, how she did so without fanfare. She liked the way Ife's hands moved when she placed a spoon down, a careful, faithful motion. "You chose a good woman to feed the house," Comfort told Namdi once, and there was no praise more complete than that. There were moments, as there always are, of awkwardness. The past has a way of returning with the unfamiliar face of memory. An old friend's apology that sounded like a transactional calculation. A headline that would surface at a party like a stubborn bruise. But overall, the slow arc of their days bent toward a steadiness that felt earned. Ife finished nursing school and later wore a uniform with earned pride. Namdi learned to find contentment in a kitchen conversation more than a red carpet. The wooden tortoise, which had once been a bedside sentinel, became a fixture at their modest home, a small emblem of patience and a reminder that slow things remember. When a neighbor asked about its meaning, Ife would smile and say, "It remembers who was faithful." Namdi would add, "Sometimes, and it reminds us how to take our time." Years later, when a reporter asked Namdi whether he regretted the way he had chosen to seek truth, he answered without poetry, but with honesty. He spoke of the nights he had spent turning the tortoise in his hands, of the advice his mother had given him, and of the difference between spectacle and mercy. "I wanted to know who would be there when the cameras left," he said. "I wanted hands that would warm my soup and mend my life, not hands that would pose with it." The story kept circulating because it had the ingredients people like: wealth and fallibility, spectacle and quiet redemption. But those who had been part of the closest circles remembered it differently, as a lesson about the dignity of care, and about the way love is measured in acts, not Instagram posts. Ife continued to visit ABA with Namdi, and together they served pepper soup at a community table, ladling out bowls with the same ritualized care Comfort had taught.